You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech and Future Tech Health podcast, and I have Michael Behe. He's a professor at Lehigh. We're going to be talking about the evolution of complex biochemical systems. Looking forward to speaking to him. So, Mike, thanks for coming.
Sure, my pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, and I don't know if this will take the guts out of the conversation, but you're speaking to someone that does not adhere to neo-Darwinism and all that, the modern synthesis. So don't worry or feel like you have to constantly, defend it.
Okay. That sounds
but
great.
If you would, please go into what has your research and your work been in the field of, evolutionary biology or biochemistry?
Well, for the past 20 plus years, I've been interested in the evolution of complex biochemical systems. Many folks don't realize that back in Darwin's day, they didn't know that, there were such things. The cell was thought to be a little piece of jelly, protoplasm. Their microscopes were really poor compared to modern ones. And molecules, which turn out to be the fundamental level of matter, were theoretical entities back then. Nobody was quite sure whether they existed or not. And so they concentrated on animals and visible features, visible to the pretty much to the naked eye. And then, of course, science progressed, and rather than a piece of jelly, we found out that the cell is actually run by machines. No kidding, real molecular machines. Trucks and buses and outboard motors and more computers in the cell and all sorts of fancy equipment and signals for the trucks and buses to turn left and to turn right, and it's all very, very tightly regulated. Rather than jelly, it turns out to be kind of a miniature, factory or city in its structure. So I grew up kind of believing in Darwin's theory because that's what I was always taught in school. But at some point, for some reason, I started to question it. And 20 years ago, I decided that, in fact, it was grossly inadequate to describe the biochemical foundation of life. And so I wrote a book that quickly got me in trouble, but nonetheless argues that rather than random changes and filtered by natural selection, that most of life, the major features, are overwhelmingly designed, purposely designed by an intelligent agent. And so that's, as you might expect, caused a bit of controversy. But I've been following it up for 20 years, and my conclusion for myself only gets stronger and stronger as we know more and more about the foundation of life.
When did the design start? Do you think it started, when life began, or when? Did it happen at various points and then stop after eukaryotic cells came about, or is it going on today? I mean, what do you think?
Well, that's an excellent question, And the short answer is I don't know. But it it since cells were around a long, long time ago, billions of years ago, clearly there must have been design before them. But as I write in my newest book, Darwin Devolves, that evolution is incapable of producing much simpler features than a complete cell. So and much simpler features than say the wings of birds and so on. So that features that arose only later in history of life would have required design as well. Now you can't tell just by looking at something, how it was made. There might have been some sort of, program or front loading of information or some such thing built into the beginning of the universe, and there was no actually active manipulating of anything along the way, or it might have, be continuously going on from moment to moment. That's a different and much harder question to address than simply, is something designed or not.
Well, you just mentioned the wing. It makes no sense that there would be a partial wing and a bird would almost fly, and then all of a sudden, now it flies. It doesn't make sense. What would be the impetus to go most of the way but not complete it? And it just doesn't seem likely at all. It just seems ridiculous.
Yeah, that's quite correct. And scientists have been trying for a long, long time to come up with some credible pathway for how such things develop, such as wings, and have failed. Even to this day, nobody knows, and they're even looking at things on the grossest anatomical level. They're saying, well, maybe feathers arose first to keep a proto-bird warm. And then, luckily, it spreads out its arms, and why it finds that the feathers can also kind of give it a bit of lift off the ground, and that's what we term in science a just so story. Kind of like the children's stories that Rudyard Kipling wrote in the early part of the 20th century. How the tiger got its stripes and how the giraffe got its neck and so on. They're essentially just inventions with no solid evidence to support them. And even worse is that we now know, with the work of science in the past 75 years, that feathers are made from molecules, and they have much fine structure. They're not just little things that can change into something more complex quickly or rapidly. And absolutely no one even tries to explain the evolution of feathers in real detail, let alone everything else that's necessary for flight. And that's one of the things that really surprised me when I first got into this business in the early 90s, is that I had been taught that Darwin's theory explained everything, but and I believed it, but then I started to wonder, and I said, well, let me go into the science library and look up papers that try to explain or see what has been explained. And it turns out, pretty close to nothing has been explained in real detail. It just seems that over time, Darwin's theory got to be the only acceptable explanation, and people assume it's truth rather than demonstrating it. And when you become a little bit skeptical, it doesn't take long at all to see that it's pretty much a house of cards.
Well, why then are people so virulently opposed to anything but Darwinism? Why do they get so angry and they make fun and they go crazy if you suggest anything else?
Yeah, that's a good point. If you want to kill your career in in biology, all you have to do is suggest that, well, Darwin didn't quite get it right. Well, that's an excellent question, and it's a complicated topic, but I think there are a couple of reasons for it, and one is that even from the beginning, with Darwin and his friends, such as Thomas Huxley, who was a biologist back then, and a group of other scientists called the X Club. They were secular folks, and they wanted to kind of break the influence of the Church of England back then. And they thought that if science could be seen as the only arbiter of explaining living things, then they would have gone a long way to achieve their goal. And also, since then, many other folks have taken are probably similarly motivated. That is, they think that if there's anything other than chance or some completely unintelligent, unguided process, then that leaves open the door for teleology, and that smacks of religion, and many folks, especially in science, are viscerally opposed to that. There are some folks who aren't so viscerally opposed, but they kind of have been immersed in these assumptions like I was before I thought about it 20-ish years or so ago. And so they really can't think of anything else. And the culture, our culture, says that if you doubt evolution, why you're either dumb or blinded by religion or some such thing, and you can be ignored. And so if people hear objections, scientists hear objections, most often they don't try to actually answer them. They just kind of laugh and go about their business. They don't even bother with it. So
what are some examples that have continued to reinforce your belief that there has to be a designer when things are designed? Like, maybe a few watershed moments over the past 30 years that just hit you like a ton of bricks.
Well, one is when you actually read about biochemical systems. I'm sure that most folks listening to the podcasts don't have a background in biochemistry, but it turns out that at the very foundational level of life, things are really elegant and super complex. One good example that I wrote about in Darwin's Black Box, which was my first book on this topic, is something called the bacterial flagellum. And it's actually literally, it's an outboard motor that bacteria use to swim. It's got a propeller. It's got a drive shaft that connects the propeller to the motor. It has a motor that uses the flow of acid from the outside of the cell to the inside to power the turning of the motor, just kind of like water flowing over a dam can power a turbine, the turning of a turbine. It has clamps to hold it on to the membrane while it's turning, just like we need clamps to hold an outdoor motor on a boat in our everyday world while it's doing its job. And also, it's got dozens and dozens of mechanical parts that have to fit together really closely for it to work. And so that, to most people, that screams design, because we recognize that a mind has done something when we see parts that have been arranged for a purpose. Whenever we see letters put together to spell words, or notes put together to make some nice tune, or physical parts put together to make a machine, we always realize that took intelligence, because random processes can't see ahead, they can't plan, they can't have purposes. So that's the basic That's the basic realization that life is, stunningly complex down to a very basic level, and it has all the hallmarks of design, a purposeful arrangement of parts. And my next two books, one was called The Edge of Evolution, which came out in the year 2007, and then one just came out in 2019. It's called Darwin Devolves. They probe how much evolution can explain versus what required design. It's clear that Darwin's mechanism does explain some things, just not everything. It can change organisms around the edges, but it can't make anything fundamentally novel. The second book, Edge of Evolution, showed that even to change two tiny parts of a cell, two amino acid residues in a particular protein, requires an enormous number of chances, enormous number of possibilities. And I talked about the development of resistance to the anti-malarial drug chloroquine, and showed that it takes an astronomical number of malaria parasites to develop resistance to it, because you have to get two things correct at once, not just one thing. You need to get two things correct at once. And Darwin's mechanism is great if you only have to change one thing at a time. And when I say one thing, I mean one thing at the molecular level at a time. But if you need two or more coordinated changes, it very, very rapidly becomes too difficult of a task for Darwin. And the final book, the most recent book, it's called Darwin Evolves. I picked that title because I wanted to be in your face about it. I wanted to make it provocative as possible. And it describes the newest results in the past 10 years or so from science. And science has really advanced rapidly in our ability to sequence DNA to determine the exact ordering of DNA units called nucleotides in the DNA of anything. Most people have heard about the human genome being sequenced, and that was celebrated in the year 2000 with much fanfare by Bill Clinton and Tony Blair, the Prime Minister of Great Britain at the time. But it turns out that methods to do things like that have been improved, and so now we have the complete DNA sequences of dogs and cats and cows and gorillas and zillions of bacteria and so on. And it turns out that the interesting thing is that when we look at the DNA changes that are the mutations that help an organism and are selected by Darwin's natural selection, it turns out that the great majority of them are ones that break or degrade pre-existing genes. They're not building anything, they're breaking what's already there. And it's kind of like, how would you quickly get better gas mileage in your car? Suppose your life depended on getting better gas mileage for your car. What changes could you make quickly? And of course, the easiest thing to do is, take off the hood and throw it away, or take out the spare tire and throw it away, and lighten the load as much as possible. And those things are, of course, hoods and spare tires are useful in many occasions, but if your life depended on you getting better gas mileage right now, then stripping down the car is the way to go. It turns out that much evolution is like that. It does help. Some changes do help, and they are selected, just like Darwin would think, but they are breaking things that were already there. And in the book, I give some other examples. It turns out that our best friend different dog breeds. It turns out that the DNA sequence of a bunch of different dog breeds has been determined in the past 10 years or so. You can get the DNA of, Chihuahuas versus Great Danes versus Bulldogs and so on.
So what did they notice? Yeah, in comparison, what did they notice?
Yeah. Well, again, if it's this pattern that the mutations that are responsible for these features, which breeders like and select kind of in an imitation of natural selection, are broken genes. So, for example, in a bulldog, if you want a dog that with a shortened snout, what you do is break the gene that's responsible for the snout being elongated. And if you want a Chihuahua with short legs, you break the gene that helps make the legs of a dog longer, and so on. And another example I gave, interestingly, is the polar bear. The polar bear is thought to have evolved from a brown bear, grizzly bear type of bear, a couple 100,000 years ago. And indeed, the DNA genome, the entire DNA complement of both the grizzly bear and the polar bear has been determined, and it shows that polar bears derived from the brown bears mostly by breaking genes. The gene for the pigmentation in a brown bear's fur is broken, and so the polar bear's fur is white. And it turns out that there's a gene in fat metabolism that allows polar bears to eat a high-fat diet. They eat a lot of seal blubber, much more than a grizzly bear could. And it turns out that's due to a broken gene, a gene that's involved normally in fat metabolism, which is broken, which keeps a lot of cholesterol out of the polar bear's blood. So, turns out that these things are working, but by breaking stuff. And there's only so far you can go with that. You can improve things, but the polar bear isn't going to go back and start eating nuts and berries again like a grizzly bear. It's not going to get its brown fur back.
Question here then. So where are the ends of the tree of life, you could say? So is it possible for humans to evolve anymore? What about dogs? Are they at their final, state, and they can only devolve from here? I mean, why, bears, where's the pinnacle of bearness and everything else, the evolution of that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I actually address exactly that in the book, Darwin Devolves. And I say that a good place, a likely place to say where the edge is, that where you can't evolve something to that degree, is at the biological classification level of family. So there's 8 major classifications. The lowest is species, the next is genus, and the next is family. And beyond there's another 5. So family is things like cats versus dogs versus bears versus raccoons and so on. So my argument in that book is that if you had a generic dog, you could not get a cat or a bear or a raccoon from that. Those are different families that design, that is, you need purposefully to build into an organism the information that reaches down all the way from cells through vertebrates, through mammals and so on, all the way down to the level of family. All that has to be specified. But then once you have a generic dog, you can get wolves versus foxes, and once you have a generic cat, you can get lions and tigers, and pumas and domestic cats and so on.
But wouldn't this suggest that there's an idealized thing called dog or cat or raccoon, and everything else is just a breaking of certain genes, that's a devolution of that idealized form, like it's platonic form?
Well, yeah, I don't know if it's in a platonic form. I think there was a real, creature which had pretty much all the, all the genes necessary to be a dog, and then yes, it would devolve into the various genera and species that we put into the dog family, like what are they? Those coyotes and wolves and foxes and stuff. So yeah, and as in the case of the polar bear, breaking those things can allow them to adapt to different environments. Polar bear can live places that the grizzly bear can't, and can eat things that the grizzly bear can't. So it kind of increases the diversity of life, but it's not building things. And Darwin's claim to fame was that he thought that he had discovered how life could arise and build itself up from scratch with nothing more than random changes, random mutations, plus the magic of natural selection. But it turns out it doesn't get you that far. It only can get you. It can only give you changes in stuff that's already there, and mainly by breaking them.
So, in studying small-scale things like the human cell or flagellum, etc., a thought occurred to me. So, with people, I approximate like 120 billion people have ever lived. Yet, just about all the people have 2 eyes, not 3, and they have a heart in a certain spot in their body and a liver, and the organs have the same relative positions, the same relative size and dimensions, and all that. Like, where are the plans kept for all of that in a cell? Have we identified that they're kept in the DNA, or like where are they?
Well, that's a great question, and the short answer is we've identified some things, but certainly far from having definitive answers. Scientists have shown that there are genes that are control genes, which control when another gene is turned on or off. And then, matter of fact, there are networks of these genes where one turns one off, but if a second one is turned on, then it modifies the first one, and all sorts of fancy stuff. And these networks are reminiscent of computer programs and extremely sophisticated circuits, and it is believed, control what sort of animal is built from some instructions in the DNA. But especially these days, people are wondering exactly whether DNA carries all the information or whether it's stored in other things, maybe in spatial configurations in the cell, or modification of the DNA, during the lifetime of an animal, which used to be heretical. But yeah, so the short answer is yes, some things are known, but most things aren't.
Yeah, I also think about like the concept of a holobionts. We have billions and trillions of bacteria and funguses and viruses and yeast, and they help us live. We help them live. I mean, it just makes the complexity of a living creature it just makes it like stupefying.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and all of this has been realized only in the past 20-ish or more years. Nobody knew that bacteria and they contribute to our well-being, and nobody knew that viruses could carry information from one species to another and help and possibly change the species. And all of these things are brand new. Darwin had no idea of any of it, and the complexity of life has mushroomed since not only since his day, but since I began in this business. I got my doctorate in biochemistry in the late 70s, 40 years or so ago, and it's gotten crazily more complicated even since then, and more and orders of magnitude more elegant. We now realize that things we didn't know existed a couple years ago. We now realize that life could not occur without them, and so all this time since Darwin's Origin of Species, people kind of naively thought that they had solved everything. And increasingly, people know they haven't, but they still insist that whatever answer we eventually come up with, it'll just have to fit into Darwin's theory, or at least into some unintelligent process, simply because I think of the philosophical implications of design and teleology and so on.
Yeah, like even the ribosome makes like tens of thousands of different proteins and amino acids it assembles.
Yeah,
I mean, even just that, it's crazy. How does it do that?
It's interesting. There's a prominent guy, a real smart fellow named Eugene Koonin, who works at the National Library of Medicine, and he has despaired. He's a real Darwinist, but he says the origin of life is such a big problem. How do you get a ribosome? How do you get all the things that the ribosome needs to work and so on? And he has despaired so much that he said it must be due to a multiverse. That is, there are 10 to the 1,000th power universes, and just by accident, things kind of glommed together in our lucky universe and produced the first life. But that's pretty crazy. I don't think many people will be convinced by that. It's got a lot of problems of its own, philosophical as well as scientific.
So if you believe that there's a designer, do you think at some point in our exploration that we're going to be stopped? There'll just be a wall put up essentially where we can just go no further because of the laws of the universe, like a Heisenberg uncertainty in biology, that we're just going to run into this wall and we just can't go any further?
Well, I don't think so. I think it's kind of that we'll always be able to learn more and more, but we'll never be able to learn everything or sufficiently to say exactly how life works and exactly how, say, the universe arose and stuff. I think that if you look at the history of science, it's kind of a history of people making progress and then thinking they've pretty much had it all solved, and then somebody comes up with some brand new thing, and they work on that and think they've got it all solved, and they come up with something new. I think that'll probably happen, with modern science too. That we'll think that there's something. We'll see that there's things that had not been discovered or even thought of before, and people will work on that, and they'll exhaust that, and then find even more stuff. And so I think that rather than coming up against a wall, we'll find that science is really inexhaustible because the universe and life is pretty much inexhaustible in its complexity and features.
Mm. Yeah, another question. I know these are impossible questions, but where is the cell alive? What part of the cell? Where's the brain of the cell? Where's the life essence of the cell? Where is it?
Yeah, that's a great question, and again, the short answer is I have the foggiest idea. It's clear that, if you take every piece of the cell, it's they're just chemicals. There's proteins, they're made of amino acids, and DNA is made out of nucleotides, and it's got fats and sugars and stuff in it, and yeah, it a single cell, if that's not alive, then nothing's alive. You can watch these things under a microscope, and they go around, they search for food, they do all sorts of intelligent things. And where is the intelligence? It's hard to say, even for a cell, let alone for a more advanced kind of creature like bunny rabbits or even humans. So that's still a mystery, and whether it's even cells or conjunctions of physical and non-physical substances, well, I think it's still an open question.
Yeah, I mean, what's the simplest thing that is alive to you? Is it a virus or is it something else? And you look at that. Where is the life in it? Where does it come from? Where's the agency? Where's the self-referential nature? It's weird.
Yeah, it is. Well, if you think exclusively in physical terms, I don't think you'll ever decide where life is because everything's reduced to physical stuff, and you just add one more nut or bolt or screw or something like that to a collection, and it's not going to magically turn from non-living to living. So maybe there's something we're missing, but I personally would draw the line at cells. I don't think viruses are alive. I think they're kind of carriers of information, but are not themselves alive. But cells can live and eat and reproduce and all sorts of things. So I would say that would be my line at the cell.
So what, I don't know, where do you think we'll be able to do things like precision medicine that people are talking about, or do you think there's no way because of the complexity of people, for instance?
Well, I think a lot of progress can be made. I don't know if, it'll be able to cure everything, but there's certainly some areas in which it will be a great help, I think, and specifically on things like cancer or genetic diseases like that, where it turns out cancers are oftentimes due to mutations in genes that break controls so that the cell doesn't stop dividing and so on. And if you can determine which genes in a particular person have been broken, and then you can develop drugs and other methods to address that particular person's cancer. So yeah, I think personalized medicine can contribute a lot, but there will be limitations. It's not easy to do these things, and I like to tell my students when I'm teaching class that the very first genetic molecular disease that was discovered was sickle cell disease, and that was discovered in the 1940s. That is the mutation behind the sickle cell disease, and we still don't have a cure for sickle cell anemia. So knowing what's wrong and doing something about it are two different things.
Yeah, I was going to ask you also about cancer itself. Scientists say that a single cell mutates and somehow it's able to be so successful that it grows, into a whole tumor of billions of cells and on and on and on. And it just doesn't seem like, certainly it's not random, and certainly one single cell doing that wouldn't be enough for all this to happen. I guess I personally think it's a whole cascade of hundreds of thousands of cells that it happens to. But I mean, what are your thoughts? Knowing what you know.
Well, I'm no cancer expert, but I think there certainly are a cascade of events. But in the human body, there are trillions of cells. So if just one of them or a few of them have some mutation that breaks some control region to keep a cell from dividing, or breaks a control region that turns off its ability to, invade other cells or some such thing, then it certainly could, of course it does, escape and become a tumor. But the important point for my discussion here is that in cancer, nothing's being built either. And as in cancer, I think you see real Darwinian evolution in action. That things
That's
succeed.
what I was going to tell you, right?
Yeah.
That's what I was going to tell you. Because of all the things it can do, yet it still is very similar to our, somatic cells. This seems like evolution in action. Adaptation, really.
That's right. It adapts to grow more strongly in a body, but it's not making anything, and ultimately it's destructive. And that's probably.
Would you say that is there no such thing as evolution? There's just adaptation? Is that fair to say?
Well, it depends on how you define evolution, and it's a very flexible word. I'm happy to say that there is evolution, but sickle cell is evolution in the sense that it adapts people to live in malarial environments, but of course it leads to bad stuff too, like sickle cell anemia. I guess it depends on your definition. But I've got enough debates on my hand that I don't want to debate people over whether evolution occurs at all. I'm happy to say that it does, but that it's very limited in its scope and it's mostly degradative changes.
So when do you think that again? What do you think the designer? I just call it God. When do you think he intervened and imposed his design? Does he still do so today? Has he stopped for the past 1,000 years for some reason or other? Like, what's your thought process there?
Well, I don't know, but probably there's a lot of philosophical considerations you have to take into effect, and it's notoriously difficult to decide what God wants to do and what he's done in the past and so on. But I think we probably reached the end of designing stuff. I think for philosophical reasons that humans are the kind of the goal of all this, simply because we are rational, intelligent, have minds, can respond to the world that God made, and so I think that's an obvious or an excellent candidate for a good stopping point for making life on Earth.
What about artificial intelligence? Do you think that there's going to be a fundamental limit to it, where it'll never be a new form of life with its own agency?
Yeah,
it's missing that.
Yeah, I'm a real big skeptic about artificial intelligence. Certainly about strong artificial intelligence. I don't think the smart guys will ever get to make a computer that could rival human thinking, and never get a computer that actually does think. And so far, there's a lot of people have tried, and I don't see anything too impressive. We can't even get self-driving cars without plowing over some pedestrians or stuff. So yeah, I don't think a mind is a physical thing, although it needs physical stuff to work. And so I don't think a computer or machine that is a candidate for artificial intelligence, I don't think it will ever have a mind or real true intelligence.
Okay. And I guess last question is, so if you were all of a sudden in control of the NIH and you could direct all its funding, what would you have it work on? What are the most important things in science you think need to be worked on?
I think what is being worked on already is really good, because 95% of science is pretty much just finding out what things are in life and how they work and so on. There's only a small portion that's involved in, asking questions about Darwinian evolution. I would myself like to see projects on, what can evolution really do and look for the limits of these changes, because that could have some practical implications. If we found out, for example, the limits of certain bacteria to evolve drug resistance, then we might be able to design drugs that don't become outdated because of resistance. But right now, nobody even looks for that because they think that, well, since evolution produced all this wonderful stuff, that there's no stopping bacteria from getting around any drug that we might come up with. So it discourages people from even looking. But if you think there is a limit or an edge, so to speak, to evolution, then you would be interested in such questions. So I'd try to.
Well, that's why I wanted to ask you.
Uh-huh.
If you're trapped in the Darwinian paradigm, that to me closes your mind off to a lot of avenues of research and science.
Uh-huh.
So if you have this different perspective that things are just unbelievably complex, and that there is design in order to get this successful complexity, I'll call it, then how does that inform how science is done? How does it change how science is done, in your opinion?
Yeah, it can make a big difference. As I said, for the workaday projects in science, just determining how things work right now, or what existed in the past, or so on, then that can go on pretty much as is. But when you're thinking about how things change and things like disease, or how we might get new crops to feed more people without being susceptible to infections and all sorts of things, then if you have a design approach rather than a Darwinian approach, you might have consider a whole lot more possibilities than you otherwise would.
Well, very good. So what's the best way for people to find out more about your work and engage with you? Is it just start reading your books, or what do you recommend?
Yeah, that's the best thing to do. Yeah, I've written 3 books, and they're all available on Amazon and Barnes and Noble and so on. And it makes builds a case. So just look up my name, Michael Behe, on Amazon, and you can start with the first one, Darwin's Black Box, and then lead on up. And I also write some essays. Mostly they're found at the Discovery Institute website. Discovery Institute is a kind of a think tank that champions intelligent design. So if you just kind of poke around for my name, you'll come across all of this stuff.
Okay, that's great. Well, Mike, I really appreciate you being here and fielding the softball questions I've been throwing at you.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. I've had a good time.
You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you.